From Fedor versus Lesnar to Khabib versus Tony, there's nothing more upsetting than a dream fight not being brought to reality. And it's the fans who are always robbed. One of the greatest heavyweights of all time, Fedor Emelianenko, never fought in the UFC. And we missed out on a super fight between Fedor and Brock Lesnar because of it. With an infamous 27-fight win streak, Fedor had the whole world marveling at his great skills. Many had him as the best heavyweight in the world, despite him never stepping foot inside the octagon. At the time, the UFC had a dominant champion in Brock Lesnar.
Oh man, it took me a little while just to get acclimated. Words can't describe it. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Who was also the pay-per-view star of the company. Imagine the buzz that the fight would have created. Now, to the UFC's credit, they did try their best to strike a deal with Fedor, but for reasons unknown, they just couldn't come to an agreement. Dana White, to this day, calls it one of his biggest failures.
No, I mean, I don't dislike Fedor or anything like that. But no, it didn't happen. You know, just we gave it a shot. We can't say we didn't try. We gave it a shot, and it is what it is.
This fight would have probably taken place at the Cowboys Stadium. It would have most certainly been the biggest UFC fight of all time. It's a shame we never got to see those two go at it. And because of that, the question remains to this day, how good was Fedor really? I mean, dominating the competition in pride is great, but being in the UFC is a whole other beast. Guess we'll never know if he could have become the champ and left no doubt about himself being the greatest heavyweight of all time. Speaking of GOATs, this next one might have narrowed down the argument, but Khabib and GSP were never destined to fight. It gives me goosebumps just thinking about how big a fight that could have been. A former two-division champion and one of the greatest fighters of all time, taking on the undefeated, undisputed UFC lightweight champ Khabib Nurmagomedov.
I'm very sad about I'm all my team here without my father. This everything because of my father. Alhamdulillah. Thank you so much, Father. Coach Javier, come here, brother. Coach.
They've both been called the greatest of all time, so why not fight each other to find out who the best really is? Now, it should be noted that GSP fought in a different era and is a few years older than Khabib. The Canadian star had nothing left to prove in his career after he beat Michael Bisping for the middleweight title. But George always said that the one guy he'd always come back for would be Khabib. The Eagle, on the other hand, was more than happy to fight him, often calling him out, respectfully that is. It was a dream fight no one wanted to miss, but unfortunately, the UFC wasn't on board. At the time, Khabib held the 155-pound belt, and the UFC didn't want to risk a retired fighter coming in and disrupting the division.
And he talked about, oh, please finish your fight. I said, don't worry about this. You know I am already deserve this. And after first round, I talked with him. After second, after when fight finish.
The matchmakers would come to regret this decision as the demand for this super fight grew significantly. In October 2020, Nurmagomedov announced his retirement and vacated the belt. The UFC tried to book the fight, but it was too little too late. It's just one of those dream matchups that we'll be talking about for many years without knowing what would really happen. But this isn't the only super fight that GSP would have been a part of. His potential clash with Anderson Silva would have been nothing short of epic. The greatest welterweight of all time against the greatest middleweight of all time. Both were at the prime of their careers, dominating everyone in their divisions. After a while, you start running out of competition, so a super fight might have benefited both their careers. The matchmakers were on board too, and both fighters were open to the idea. At that time, this fight was expected to create such a buzz that Dana wanted this fight to be in a stadium.
How was everything?
It was my turn now because last time he came from behind. I was at the restaurant and he took me by surprise. I told his team, I said, listen, I'm going to slide behind him like a ninja, and it's going to be my turn this time to get him. It's crazy.
But as they got closer to finalizing the deal, more and more issues came up. The biggest one was size. As dominant as GSP was in his own weight class, he'd never fought anyone with such a size advantage.
Taking a fight, it takes a lot out of me because I'm very proud. It's very important for me. So when I perform, I have to do it the best I can, and the result matter very much for me. So it takes a lot of stress.
It should be noted that Silva was a huge middleweight and had some great success at light heavyweight too.
So I'm so happy. I'm so happy because, first of all, New York City is my second house. I love New York. I love the people in New York, and I have a lot of fans in here. And I just
So for George, the only requirement was that the two meet in the middle and have the fight at a catch weight between 170 and 185. But the UFC didn't like that idea, and the fight never ended up being booked. Say what you want, GSP is a smart guy. He wouldn't fight the dominant champion in his prime at his own weight. But as soon as good old Mikey B gets his hand on gold, the Canadian swoops in and cements his legacy. It's all about the timing, folks, which is why we'll never have this next super fight. Jorge Masvidal to take on Conor McGregor. Maybe never. Well, technically, this fight could still happen. Both guys are active on the roster, and now that Conor has put on all the weight, they're likely to be fighting in the same weight class. So why am I saying that we were robbed of this super fight? As I mentioned earlier, it's all about the timing. Back in early 2020, both fighters were at their peak, both in terms of the fan following as well as their rankings. Conor had gotten back in the win column after a 40-second TKO win over Cowboy Cerrone. Masvidal, on the other hand, was fresh off his BMF title win and was one of the biggest stars in the sport. There's no doubt in my mind that if that fight got booked at that time, it would have crossed 2 million pay-per-view buys. But the good news is, there's still a possibility for us to watch two of the most vicious knockout artists in the game. Now, this next super fight that would never happen just died recently, and it's probably why this topic is in discussion. The heavyweight clash between Francis Ngannou and Jon Jones. It's a fight that was never meant to happen. Jones had talked about moving up a weight class for many years, but it kept getting delayed.
I'm here with the winner, Jon Jones. You made it back.
I made it back, man. Man, such a beautiful moment. Man, I did a lot of right things to get back in this position.
When Jon vacated his light heavyweight title, Stipe Miocic was the champ and the heavyweight GOAT, but he was dismantled by the heaviest hitter in human history. Francis held the belt for a while and even defended it against his former teammate Cyril Gane. But at this point, there were too many issues between Ngannou and the UFC. Back in 2020, after Jon gave up his belt, he couldn't get on good terms with the UFC either. Maybe if Jon got paid earlier, if Francis's demands were met, we could have seen these two fight for the title. But Ngannou isn't in the UFC anymore. His belt was vacated and Jon won the title. Dana White came out and said Francis would never fight in the UFC again. And just like that, all our hopes died. Now, most of these super fights were never really booked, but Khabib versus Tony was canceled 5 times. It's considered to be the most cursed fight in UFC history. They are two of the greatest lightweights of all time. Both were on massive winning streaks, and no one could beat them except for each other. But as they got matched up each time, something happened and the fight had to be canceled. 2 of those times, Khabib pulled out, once due to the famous tiramisu incident, and Ferguson pulled out twice as well. One time, just days before the fight as he slipped on a cable and tore his ACL. And just when we thought it would finally work out, COVID happened and the entire world was put on lockdown. Seems like the MMA gods really didn't want us to see this fight. Well, that's all we have on the MMA super fights fans were robbed of.